More than 20 years have now passed since the close of the Second Vatican Council. Modern Catholics say that as a result, the Church has been brought into the modern world. It has become less autocratic and more democratic. Its windows were opened. Yet we are constantly reminded that nothing essential has been changed. Has nothing essential been changed? I'm Julius Smetona. This is what Catholics believe. In the 12 years following the close of the Second Vatican Council, 40,000 priests left the priesthood. In 1965, there was a seminary population of 50,000. Within 12 years, the population dipped to under 10,000. And finally, perhaps most shocking of all, over 30% of all abortions performed in the United States are performed on Roman Catholics. And yet, Roman Catholics make up less than 1/4 of the population of America. Modern churchmen would dismiss any attempt to correlate these statistics in Vatican II. My guests would, however, argue differently. With me to discuss the disaster, Vatican II, are two priests who reject the Second Vatican Council and celebrate the traditional Latin Mass exclusively. Father Donald Sanborn, pastor of St. Pius X Church in Warren, Michigan, and Father William Jenkins, pastor of St. Teresa of the Child Jesus Church in Parham, Ohio. Reverend Fathers, welcome to What Catholics Believe.
Thank you, Julius.
There was a shocking quote I came across in the July 6th edition of The Wanderer. It said that something like 73% of young Catholics believe that premarital sex is all right. 53% believe that a woman has a right to choose, and many believe that trial marriages are acceptable. Do you see any correlation between these statistics, which betray a certain eroding of the monolicity of the Church, and Vatican II, Father Sanborn?
Absolutely. There is a perfect correlation, because since Vatican II, we have seen the complete breakdown of the doctrinal discipline of the Catholic Church. Before Vatican II, it would have been unheard of that anyone would have thought that grave moral aberrations like the ones you described were okay. But now it's actually the norm. I read a poll in the Daily News not too long ago, New York Daily News, about 2 years ago, that 81% of the people in that diocese think that artificial birth control is okay. This is a very serious problem for the Catholic Church, because your membership in the Catholic Church doesn't depend simply on your name appearing on a list in your local parish. Your membership in the Catholic Church depends on your profession of the Catholic faith, your adherence to the teachings of the Catholic Church. What you're describing is a disaster for the Catholic Church, that this many young people believe things that are incompatible with its moral teaching.
How would you hold Vatican II responsible for this?
Because Vatican II created a church without dogmas. The soul of Vatican II is ecumenism, and that is the attempt to bring together all religions, to break down their differences and to bring them into one great church. And in order to do that, you must abandon the absolute nature of the teachings of the Catholic Church. You must be able to sit down with people of other religions and say, well, what we believe is negotiable. And this created a church without dogmas. So now you have utter dogmatic and moral chaos in the Catholic Church. You have people who are teaching in Catholic universities who say that sexual perversions are okay or abortion is okay. These things are unheard of. If anyone was born before 1950, they remember that this is just unheard of in the Catholic Church, that people would even think these things.
Father Jenkins, there's a well-known case of a celebrated European theologian, Hans Kung. Now, Hans Kung is often looked at, has struggles with the Vatican. He thinks the Vatican is too autocratic, too conservative. And in fact, he was actually disciplined. Now, many who say that the conservatives would be complaining that you know, the Vatican is soft on these left-liners, the classic counterexample is Hans Küng. Look, Hans Küng taught some suspect things, and they stripped him of his license to teach. How do you feel about this whole case of Hans Küng?
I think that Hans Küng is a perfect example of a fraud of disciplinary action being taken against revolutionaries in the church. Hans Küng is a man who doesn't even believe that Christ is God.
And he actually teaches this publicly.
And yet he was called to Rome, and he was disciplined. And of course, the Catholic world knows that he was disciplined and looks upon that as a great sign that, yes, Rome still is Catholic. But what was the discipline that was imposed upon him? It was simply decreed that he could no longer be considered a Catholic theologian. He's still a Catholic, and he's still a theologian, but he's not a Catholic theologian. He's still teaching theology at a Protestant faculty in Tübingen. He's still a priest in good standing. He can travel anywhere in the world and preach in Catholic pulpits and celebrate their Eucharistic liturgy anywhere. So this disciplinary action taken against him, I think, was nothing but a show to deceive people into thinking that, yes, we're still the watchdogs of the faith and we're still guarding the faith against wolves like Hans Küng. Vatican II is responsible for the unraveling of the faith. It was like a bomb going off in the church. And the attitude that came through Vatican II is that everything is negotiable. If you read the documents of Vatican II, it's like putting a vacuum cleaner to your ear and sucking out all of the concepts you have that are clear and well-defined. So that when you're done, it's as though everything is just a big mishmash. Nothing is clear anymore. There are contradictions within the documents and from one document to the other. Hans Küng is a perfect example of the fact that you can still be a priest in good standing in the so-called church today, in the conciliar church, and yet you don't have to believe anything. You don't have to believe any Catholic dogma.
What about the examples of Father Leonardo Boff and Reverend Charles Curran?
It's the same thing. No one has said to them, you are not Catholic. They have given them minor disciplines, but no one has said, you are not Catholic. Now, when you profess something that is condemned by the Catholic Church, some doctrine or some moral teaching that is condemned by the Catholic Church, you are automatically, by divine law, severed from the Catholic Church. And it is up to the authority of the Catholic Church to uphold this divine law and come down and say, you are no longer Catholic. You have severed yourself from the Catholic Church. And this is not happening. The only way it seems that you can sever yourself from this new church is by retaining the traditional Latin Mass, by being the kind of Catholic that your parents were taught to be. That's the only way that you can sever yourself today.
That's true. It seems that the only thing that is deemed worthy of condemnation today, outright condemnation, is believing in the old catechisms, offering to God the traditional Mass, and following the old moral standards of the Church.
Speaking of the old moral standards, there's much attention, I think, even in the secular press, has been devoted to the cause of marriage annulments. And throughout church history, this occasionally happened, and there are several spectacular cases. What is the current status of marriage annulments within the church? What is happening?
Well, in 1968, there were close to 500 marriage annulments in the United States. And in 1985, there were approaching 40,000. This tremendous difference belies a whole change of philosophy behind what marriage really is. You know, marriage annulments nowadays have become nothing but Catholic divorces. And the annulment rate is approaching what the civil divorce rate is among non-Catholics. Marriages are being annulled for the most frivolous reasons. You know, it is a dogma of the Catholic faith that marriage is indissoluble, that when two people marry, they marry as long as they both live. And there's no power in heaven, on earth, or under the earth that can change that. That's not so anymore. People can get married with the understanding that later on, if it doesn't work out, they can go to the Chancery office and get an annulment, put their money down, and and they get it for one reason or another. You know, you mentioned Hans Kung, Boff, Curran, and the rest of them. Well, what is happening with those theologians, by the way, many of those who are now disgraced in the eyes of the people were the theologians who were assisting the bishops as theological experts at Vatican II. So what these men are teaching now is not an anomaly and simply a misunderstanding or a misapplication of Vatican II. These were the minds behind Vatican II 20-some years ago. But the real impact we find in the parish churches. If you go into a parish church for their liturgy at 8:30, 10 o'clock, 11:15, you find that you get one priest after another, who each one of them seems to have his own religion. They all do things differently. But take the same liturgy and go down the line among the faithful who are sitting there attending that liturgy and ask each one of them what he believes about, let's say, the indissolubility of marriage, what he believes about the real presence of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament, what he believes about this or that dogma of the Church. You can ask each one of those people. They're all attending the same liturgy, but they don't have the same faith. This is the chaos that has been brought about by Vatican II.
You know, I have a personal experience. A friend of mine his wife's about to have a baby, so they went to a baptism class. And in the course of the baptism class, the priest said that limbo was an invention of St. Augustine in the 300s. And so I asked my friend, well, why are you getting baptized if it really doesn't exist? And he said, well, that's what the priest said himself. He doesn't even know why he's doing this. So I asked him, well, this priest must be one of these young radicals. He said, no, he was 62 years old. What's your, how do you react to something like this? Is this something which is just an anomaly, or is this almost a par for the course type of instance?
This is a par for the course instance. You know, I studied in this country and Europe, in seminaries, both in this country and in Europe. And I found that even in the conservative seminaries, the young men coming up for the priesthood were being trained a perverted, very self-centered, and a skeptical form of, if you can call it, Catholicism, in which nothing was sacred, nothing is true, everything is negotiable. And it's really when I began to see that the most conservative seminarians were being taught this way, and they did not react against it, that they accepted it, that I began to envision what the church of the future was going to be like. A church without doctrines, faith, and morals. A church that would be basically a reflection of the modern culture, as Vatican II pointed out in its document on the liturgy. And I just decided that I couldn't be a part of that church. I want to be a Roman Catholic. And I found that the only way to avoid helping the revolution was not to be a part of it, but just to hold to the old faith, come what may.
You're watching perhaps one of the most striking developments of Vatican II was the new Mass. The liturgy was reformed. Why don't you say the new Mass? Why are you adamant and insistent upon saying the traditional Latin Mass, Father Sanborn?
Because it looks like a Protestant service. That's why I don't say it. That's why I originally reacted to it. I reacted when I was 14 years old to the initial changes made in 1964 to the Mass, and I recognized in them the beginnings of the Protestantization of the Mass. And gradually I saw the Mass break down more and more into what it is today. And having studied it a little, I realized that they systematically pulled out of the Catholic Mass anything that was typically Catholic, and also put into the Mass things that are typically Protestant. For example, you have the role of the priest completely changed in the new Mass. In the traditional Mass, you see the priest at the altar. He is the one performing the sacrifice. He is using the official language of the Catholic Church, which is Latin. The people there are fervently participating by their prayers, but they are not offering the sacrifice properly speaking. He is the one offering the sacrifice. Now he is even called by the new liturgy the president of the assembly. Now the word president implies someone who is presiding over something that the assembly is doing, like you might say the president of the Senate, someone who presides over the Senate. That's the vice president. So also the priest now just presides over the assembly. That is a thoroughly Protestant notion of liturgy.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, it's very interesting that you mentioned this, because there is a document of tremendous historical significance which I believe very few people are familiar with, namely the Ottaviani intervention. This was, Cardinal Ottaviani was the prefect emeritus of the Holy Office. He crowned several popes, and his job was to maintain and preserve the integrity of the faith. In 1969, he wrote a letter to Paul VI, and it's interesting, in that letter he said that the Novus Ordo represents, both as a whole and in its details, a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass as it was formulated in Session 23 of the Council of Trent. He went on to say, too, in this study that they felt the real presence was undermined and that the role of the priest was changed. What was the study? How come we heard so little about it? Father Jenkins.
Well, we heard so little about it because the ordinary channels of dissemination of Catholic information would not disseminate information like this, of course. There was a revolution in progress, and that Ottaviani intervention was a direct challenge to the revolution. It pointed out what a scandal the new Mass was, and in fact, Cardinal Ottaviani said in his intervention that henceforth Catholics were going to have a very, very difficult choice. They were going to have to choose between obedience and Catholicism. They were going to have to choose whether or not to go along with the revolution embodied in the new Mass, or to hold fast to their Catholic faith. You know, the new Mass was published with an instruction booklet. It was called the General Instruction on the New Order of Mass. And that instruction booklet was basically the official commentary of the writers of the new Mass about what the new Mass is and how it is to be done. And early on in that instruction, just number 7, the first part of that instruction, it asked, well, what is the Mass? And the answer was, the Lord's Supper, and then parentheses, or Mass, close parentheses, is the gathering together of the people of God under the presidency of the priest to celebrate the memorial of the Lord. Nowhere is there any mention whatsoever of the real presence of Christ, or that this is the action of Jesus Christ offering himself in sacrifice to his Father in heaven. Nothing of the kind. That definition given in the general instruction on the new Mass is a travesty. And it shows what a sacrilege the new Mass is. It is actually meant to be an anti-Mass. It is meant to replace the true Mass.
You know, it's interesting because in the Ottaviani intervention itself, I believe it said the real presence of Christ is never alluded to, and in fact, belief in it is implicitly repudiated. And further, they say, the new order teems with insinuations or manifest errors against the purity of Catholic religion and just takes down all defenses against error. Now, my question is this. If Cardinal Ottaviani was so strong in his attack or condemnation of the pristine form of this new Mass, what would you have to say about the abuses which we see today? For instance, clown masses and so on. Father Sanborn.
I think he would be even more horrified. However, there is nothing incompatible with the clown Mass and the prescribed new Mass as it is in the Missal. As a matter of fact, there is even encouragement was given, and it's even in the general instruction, to adapt different parts of the Mass and to ad-lib here and there in order to make the Mass more interesting. And also, when you consider that the new Mass has the function of exciting in the people their religious sentiment, which is, as I said, a Protestant notion of liturgy, then anything goes practically. If the function of the priest is to get the people going, well, then clowns and whatever. I've even heard of funerals with balloons tied to the coffin, and priests coming out of the sacristy on Easter Sunday dressed in a cocoon, and then unzipping the cocoon and flapping his wings as a butterfly all around the sanctuary on Easter Sunday. I mean, this sounds ridiculous, and anybody who would want to be identified, I think, with such a faith or such a religion would have to be crazy. If you'd say, that's my faith, that's my church, when you see the priest in the butterfly outfit. It's certainly not the Catholic faith. It's not the Catholic religion that has perdured from the time of our Lord and has given us the magnificence of doctrine and morals, which has given us Gregorian chant, beautiful cathedrals, and saints, and it's not that.
Father Jenkins.
Well, we've seen all kinds of gimmickry and gadgetry going on at this new Mass. We've seen Mary Poppins Masses and Superman Masses and the Wizard of Oz Masses. Father T.Q. Quinlan, or whatever, in Norfolk, Virginia, has distinguished himself by some particularly imaginative and bizarre liturgical forms. And in 1975, at St. Philip and James Church in Columbus, Ohio, Father Engel there even had a garbage mass. He had the people come up and deposit handfuls of household garbage in a big garbage can in front of their liturgical table. Now, we hear people say, well, these are not just abuses in the Mass. That's not true. If you go back to Vatican II, you find the seeds of it all right there. The first document which the Fathers considered at Vatican II was on the liturgy. And they said right out there that an ideal to be aimed for in the liturgy is to adapt the liturgy to the local culture. Well, if you start adapting the liturgy to the local culture, you can get yourself into big trouble. And they have done away with the Latin language in order to make it possible to adapt the liturgy to the local culture. And so in some of these cultures, in some rather strange parts of the world, primitive parts of the world, they have some very bizarre elements involved in the liturgy, strange dances and so on. It's very degrading. Those who say that the strange elements that have crept into liturgy are nothing but abuses are wrong. These were all foreseen by Vatican II. The seeds are right there.
What about communion in the hand? I saw an article once which said that the priest told the people that if they come to the communion rail, they should receive, because there's a problem of hosts being scattered on the floor. And on one occasion, they actually had to use a vacuum cleaner to pick up the hosts. What's the meaning of this?
It's another sign of the abandonment of the belief in the real presence. The new Mass is loaded with such signs, such as no longer using gold and silver for the chalice, the priest no longer taking care of the particles on his hand, the suppression of genuflections, very, very many, if not most, yes, most of the genuflections at the new Mass were suppressed. And the idea of giving it out to people to hold in their hands is just one more breakdown of the belief of the sacredness of the body and blood of Christ. There was a man who saw a host on the floor of the cathedral in the diocese out west, and was horrified by it, went to the bishop's house next door to complain about it, and the bishop sat him down, and one of the first things that he said was, we no longer believe in transubstantiation.
Well, I have a parishioner, in fact, who was a Eucharistic minister. And he always worried that there was so much wine left in the cups that were made available to the people at communion time. They were all taken and put off to the side. And he concerned himself with going over and emptying every one of them himself. And finally, he was told not to do that. Well, one day, he followed them back into the sacristy, and he found the priest pouring them down the drain of the sink. There's no belief in the real presence there. It's an absolute travesty. And even such simple things as maintaining the use of the gold plate when you're distributing Holy Communion to catch the particles of the host, They have no concern whatsoever for the particles of the host that fall to the floor. Any Catholic who still believes in the real presence of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament has no business being in those churches.
Fathers, we're running out of time. I'd like to thank you for a fascinating half